Adelante, Benjamín.
Muy buenos días, buenas tardes en el presente, en el futuro. Mi nombre es Benjamín Mayer, soy el director de 17 Instituto de Estudios Críticos. Tengo el enorme placer de dirigir estas primeras palabras en compañía de José Hamra Sazón, quien en 17 Instituto es el coordinador del programa Babélica, y de nuestro extraordinario invitado, Joseph Scalia III, quien tendrá para nosotros un papel especial, puesto que abrirá esta actividad nueva, un poco distinta del programa Babélica. Y estamos de algún modo pues planteando su presencia y sus palabras a modo de epígrafe a esta actividad para de alguna manera dar cuenta del espíritu de Babélica en la medida en que hemos encontrado un interlocutor, privilegiado para el proyecto que hemos ideado con José Hamra desde el año 2021. Voy a pasar al inglés porque la conversación con Joseph va a ser en inglés, habrá subtítulos, se pueden también seleccionar en la propia red social. Entonces, paso a ese idioma. So, Joseph Scalia III holds a Doctor of Psychoanalysis degree in Psychoanalysis, Society, and Culture. He is a psychoanalyst in private practice and a social and environmental critic and activist. He has led 2 Montana wilderness preservation groups, informing his environmentalism work. Dr. Scalia has led community-wide large group interventions following serial suicides that threatened to explode into greater violence, plus a similar experience regarding potentially explosive racial violence. And Scalia has led outpatient groups and residential treatment programs for violent adults and adolescents. He is the author of Intimate Violence, Attacks upon Psychic Interiority. So, welcome, my dear Joe. It's really wonderful to have you here. We're very proud and grateful to be able to have this conversation in order to deepen our understanding of our own intentions with the Babélica program, insofar as we have found a great resonance with your own work and thinking. You have a long experience by now, as your bio clearly suggests, and we know that you have not only intervened, but you have developed certain concepts around what we have described as world making, intervening in situations of tension, of aggression, of violence, and so on. And I'd like to invite you to talk about your sense and idea around the phrase the failing human project that appears in your work and that we might suppose is a result of your trajectory up to now.
Thank you, Benjamin. And it's very good to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I was thinking just this morning of experiences that led me to the thoughts we'll talk about today. And a couple other came to mind that I'd like to share ever so briefly. I've also been director of a place called Constancy House, which was for violent, adolescents, where in a year's time while I was there, we had no violent episodes, which was amazing. And then I was also staff psychologist at Arkansas State Prison decades ago, where, of course, there were, as you might expect, violent men. And I was a psychologist at their residential treatment program. So yeah, it just goes back a long ways. I found myself reflecting on. So the Failing Human Project, this is actually a term I picked up from the psychoanalyst and author Christopher Bolus, and colleague of mine, Christopher Bolus, as we were talking about the state of the world a few years ago. And he was, after decades of work, reflecting on the dismal picture. And so, yeah, for me, the Failing Human Project is twofold. Civilizationally, as we've moved into quite a global community, which has its very noticeable advantages, it also makes it easier to fall apart as a worldwide civilization. And, here we are with so much neoliberal capitalism pushing on us as a human collective, generating so much short-sighted thinking by so many people. If I can get this, everything will be great. Very consumerist and competitive, and again, short-sighted. And also then, as an environmentalist, let me back up. And so, yeah, so there's the neoliberal capitalism, and then there's, rising fascism and all sorts of genocidal tensions and threats. And then in the environmental world, there's global warming, of course, where we're falling apart again, failing in an effort to be human, to have. So by human, I'm thinking, a human collective, and most people, the vast majority of people, having an ethic of the good of the all. And so in our relationship to nature too, we're destroying it. We see global warming, and it's very much in the foreground of public discourse and discussion, but there are so many other ways. And for me, as an environmentalist in the Rocky Mountains and middle to northern Rocky Mountains of the United States, yeah, I've seen so much violence to different species, so much greater species threats, so much logging that did not need to happen, and that is celebrated by the government as wonderful in one way or another. So, we're just, et cetera. You can go on about, the acidification of the ocean, mines that are going on while we pretend we're going to green the earth, yet we're going to mine all sorts of things to make the world green, right? To have new technologies that make us green, and they cause their own devastation. So that's what I mean by Failing Human Project. Oh, you're muted.
Thanks. Before passing to you, Jose, I want to just underline a couple of points. The first is that it's very stimulating for us to have this conversation with you because, of course, Babélica began concentrated on the conflicts around Israel and Palestine. But insofar as we're reflecting on the general approach to conflict, to war, to peace building, to world making, and so on, then of course all these other scenarios that you've described become absolutely pertinent to the discussion, right? We have all sorts of conflicts that are current and very much alive, unfortunately. So I think it's interesting to reflect for a moment on our approach to all of them and so on. And I only want to additionally underline two things, and that is that something that we find especially interesting about your work and your experience is that you have not only gone to great lengths in dealing with social questions and questions of the severing or even the destruction of social ties and so on. So your activity has been very much visible socially and in the public sphere, but you also have a very detailed reflection on the very experience of this activity within your own self, so that you are eloquent towards the social sphere, but also towards the inner workings of the experience and the dealings that the intervenant, as you have described it, has to face through all of these circumstances and so on. So over to you, Jose, perhaps for a next question.
Thanks, Benjamin, Joseph. So yeah, I think, well, there's something that resounds of your work with Babélica and with what we are watching and testifying right now in Israel-Palestine. So when you talk about failing human project, it looks like a very bleak diagnosis. So what is your proposal to deal with this seems to be pessimistic scenario?
Yes, thank you. Well, there is a term that I've coined, disputational dialogue, by which I mean the bringing together of antagonistic groups who seem entirely unable to speak with one another, who get into opposition that becomes polarized and filled with attachment to very narrow points of view. And those attachments are inextricably tied to great hostilities, threats of violence, sometimes violence, and just like hatred and vilification, the degradation of each other, the dehumanization, and like I like the term sanctimonious rectitude. You know, I am right and I am better than you, and you are subhuman. I'm better than you in being right, and this is just pervasive. So dialogical or disputational dialogue is bringing people together to actually speak with one another instead of just to oppose one another. And so, now obviously this has to be managed by someone, and this is to facilitate, which is a word I really do not like, and thus the word intervenant. But which we'll come back to. But an intervenant has to help these opposing groups hear each other. So the goal immediately is for everyone or whoever wants to speak fully, to present their point of view, to attempt to do it respectfully. The intervenant will go to task when it moves into disrespect. And for the listeners to attempt to hear respectfully and to come to understand, for each side to come to understand, oh, this is what organizes this person's thinking. This is how they justify their thinking, to move out of just a judgmentalism into a kind of radical reception of the humanity of the other. So that's so disputes become discussed, and there is a dialogue instead of just a hurling contempt at each other.
So, well, you just mentioned it, and there's this figure then that is the intervenant. In order to have the dispositional dialogue between these antagonistic groups of people. What are the needs or the requirements for the intervenant as a figure that looks to be central in this proposal?
Yeah, thank you, Jose. This is probably the most crucial aspect of what I'm proposing. So in this denigration of one another, there is what we might think of from a psychoanalytic perspective as toxicity. And toxic projection. So I'm going to project onto you. I'm going to see you as being a way that I cannot recognize in myself, something disturbing to me that I cannot take account of. It would rattle my foundation. So it doesn't exist in me, it exists in you. So I am not hateful, you are hateful. And so in the communication, if you want to call it that, which is probably a too admirable term for what happens, but we'll say in this communication, there is an intensity, a striking out in the language that is, to give it a certain term, toxic. And so it's that poison, that toxicity that fills the listener immediately and induces them to stop hearing and to defend themselves against the reception of, because it feels horrible, it's threatening, it's degrading. And so the job of the intervenant is to experience that toxicity, even when not directed at her or him, to allow it to, well, it will flow into the body and the mind of the intervenant in one way or another, or in any number of ways. And it becomes that person's job, then, the intervenants, to then what we might call detoxify those projections that have been, split off from the projector. And so to hear those things in a way, for the intervenant to hear those things beyond the hatred, to hear the veiled, the momentarily or even consistently derailed humanity of that speaker who is projecting a toxicity. And so to go beyond what we might think of as a symptom, the toxic projections, to what drives that symptom. And again, to find the human who is a more whole person than just what you're seeing in this part of them that goes to violence. So when that is detoxified in the intervenant can speak in a way that immediately humanizes, that is experienced by, is felt by, even registered bodily, somatically, in those who are experiencing toxicity, who then feel a de-escalation of it and are moved toward thought instead of expulsion of experience. So it's that detoxification by the intervenant and a speaking at those moments in a way that is felt as respectful, a way that is felt as humanizing in the face of, in the enactment of dehumanization. And that is taken in by both the listeners and the speakers. And that alone is a powerful intervention. So to do that, I must say, I mean, we're dealing then with the unconscious. This is the person who's projecting toxically doesn't think of themselves that way. This is unconscious. They do not have a self-representation that is consistent with how they are being experienced, how they are coming across. And they don't have a sense of distorting reality. They don't have a sense of oversimplifying reality. So these are unconscious experiences and phenomena. And this is something that the psychoanalyst is developed, let's say, or formed or trained to take account of.
Yeah, it's really fascinating and very moving. And one can see very clearly how this is applicable in all kinds of scenarios and situations. We have agreed to have a fairly short conversation with you so that people can listen and get a sense of all the voices that will come to their attention after this initial conversation, Joe. But I think it would be very useful for people to get a sense of some of your experiences and perhaps examples that you've actually, lived through. I think the general perspective and trajectory of yours is quite clear. What have been some of your actual experiences?
Yeah, thanks again. I will very briefly preface the answer to your question by saying, in order to be an intervenant, one must have what could be called the capacity of a psychoanalyst, by which I mean one has moved beyond an identification with any social order, any societally determined set of beliefs and attachments, to, as the psychoanalyst and philosopher Willie Apollon has put it in a way that I resonated with, that one, quote, lives outside the social order. So that is what is gratifying to the intervenant, to the psychoanalyst, if they really are psychoanalysts, as in not just by training, but have been formed truly to be psychoanalysts, is finding a space within themselves that is not articulable, cannot be put into words, because it is outside the social order, it is outside language, but is not driven by attachments that need to be immediately and repetitively gratified. It's living elsewhere. And so that's what allows that person to move beyond the taking sides. So example, in a small town in Montana, 7,500 people some years ago, there had been 5 deaths in a few weeks' time. One, the first, a hard automobile accident in which one of the passengers in the car was decapitated. And just as I said that, I felt in my body the horror of it like flow through me. And remembering the community's response, the community was just coming undone. And there were 4 suicides that happened in very short order after that, both students and relatives of students. The uproar in the community was beyond palpable. It was very visible. Very intense blaming, yelling, screaming, threats of violence. The police were very disturbed. The community leaders convened a meeting about this for people to come and speak. About 150 or 175 people came in a town, again, of 7,500. So that's a good number of people. They came furious, blaming, hurling all sorts of insults. It did feel like it could go to violence, but there was a practice of disputational dialogue in the way I described it. And we met for 2.5 hours, and the hostility de-escalated to the time of adjourning, when there was no more hurling of insults, no more blaming. People felt a united sense of community and left in that spirit. The room of people just felt peaceful as opposed to murderous, and there were no more suicides. So that was a pretty profound experience. One other brief experience in the same town, some months afterwards, some high school students were flying the Confederate flag, so going back to the Civil War in the United States, and the flag now being a symbol of racism and far right, we'll call it fascism. Very terrible tensions in the United States. We met again, about 35 people came. So adolescents were flying Confederate flags just off school property. So the school could not take action to require them to put these down. And again, very much uproar in the community. People came, there was disputational dialogue, the same effect occurred, and the Confederate flags were taken down by those students without any command to do so. So it was a pretty profound experience. I have many experiences like this, but we don't have time, obviously.
Just very brief, Joseph. Is disputational dialogue in a way different to conflict resolution?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, very crucial question and answer. Absolutely different. There is no determination in the beginning. There is no stated aim. This is what we want to gain in some procedural way, some manner of this is how we will operate afterwards. There is no paying attention to narrative, to the conscious mind, and just differences of opinions in one's stories. There's no paying attention to that as the privileged information, the privileged points of intervention. It is rather, that's conflict resolution, and to try to reach some end that everyone can agree upon, where people compromise, yada, yada. Instead, there is the aim of a mutual humanization, which only occurs through a dealing with the unconscious drivers of the polarization and hatred. So no aim for material outcome, and instead through this passing through the joint hatred, something new will arise. And then it will be a spontaneous movement to a new way of being.
Thanks. Benjamin?
Well, I mean, it's very impressive and very moving. One feels like really thanking you, Joseph, for doing all of this and for making visible so eloquently the complex and integrated fields that this somehow defines, right? Because it's a field that very rapidly disappears from view during the conflict. It seems that there's no space, no leeway to move in between the opposing positions and so on. So I want to thank you very enthusiastically and suggest that we are very committed to this, and we hope to continue talking and working with you and with others on this, and furthering what I call this field, this particular positioning that indeed opens up many horizons that seem lacking in the heat of conflict.
Yes, well said. And I look forward to continuing our conversation and seeing where we might take that.
Is there any reading that you can suggest us, please?
Yes, there are 3 books that I want to recommend of the many things that came to mind when you asked me earlier what I might recommend in readings. There is Meaning and Melancholia by Christopher Bolus. There is The 3 Ecologies by Felix Guattari. And there's a book that I wrote and that was published by Columbia University Press, Intimate Violence. So there's violence again, attacks upon psychic interiority. So there is the going inward again. So yeah, those 3 books.
Great, thank you very much. So we're closing this first interview, and I'm switching to Spanish just to say goodbye. Thank you very much, Joseph, Benjamín.
Thank you.
Gracias a quienes nos han acompañado y nos vemos en 10 minutos para nuestra entrevista con Hannah Beris, periodista radicada en Modín, Israel. Bienvenidos pues con esta primera exposición a esta jornada sobre Israel-Palestina a 100 días del 7 de octubre. Y bueno, pues nos vemos en unos momentos más en la siguiente transmisión. Gracias, Benjamín. Gracias, Joseph. Okay.
That was great, Joe. Thank you so much.